Pleasure to introduce Aruna Chandrasekhar, whose work I have read for a very long time. She's been a journalist in India with reputed publications, including Scroll.in, and she has since been writing internationally, including for Carbon Brief, and works on the absolute burning key issues of our time, including the energy transition, extractive economies, the climate crisis. And that's what she's going to be talking to us. If you're on Twitter, you should follow her because you get wonderful commentary from things like the COP meetings, which she regularly attends, and has a real bird's eye view on critical climate discussions and negotiations and things that happen behind the scenes. So we hope that we will hear from some of that in your talk today, and after the talk we will also have time for Q&A, and then please join us for the reception.
Thank you so much, Professor Sood. It is incredible to be here, also having followed so much of your work on development and those questions around what development means and what it has meant for marginalized communities in India and in the global south, and to see how this model has been replicated and continues to be so. Which is pretty much what today's talk is about. So yeah, it's great to be back in Oxford. I was here right before the first global climate strikes, which were happening in September 2019. And a few months before that, actually, was when there was the Sunrise Movement was organizing in the US and was pushing for what is now called the Green New Deal. And in February of 2019, that's when the less beloved AOC, as well as Aruna or Massachusetts, had proposed a resolution demanding a 10-year action plan, which has since been seen as the Green New Deal, which feels like a bit of a breakthrough of a word, which is linking investment in technology and infrastructure to socioeconomic development as well as jobs, protecting frontline communities, and at the same time, it was linking after a really long time, climate justice as well as labor justice movements, which were often seen at odds, and also the social justice organizations and movements with the big green NGOs. You had your public transit advocates and meme-making pages on the same page as as solar parks, or at the same time movements which were talking about communities who've been marginalized and who've had to deal with what is often when people push to the margins of living right next to big energy and extractive projects as well as environmental facilities. I mean, its eventual wording had left many loopholes and sowed seeds of doubt, with whether around net zero and what that meant. There are fears both from the left as well as the right, looking at offsetting and other fears, and that sort of debate has continued, especially in the West. But at the same time, you had the EU announcing its EU Green Deal, not calling it a New Deal, but at the same time, it was seen as this big man on the moon moment, as Ursula von der Leyen described it as. But they've introduced new measures as part of what is being seen, and is a rapid new transition. So the 3 years since I was studying at the ECI in Oxford, there's been phenomenal amount of changes, and words which were once seen as sort of nerdy energy speak have become very much mainstream. So the term just transition has its origins in the labor and trade union movement, and the ILO defines it as greening the economy in a way that is as fair and as inclusive and equitable, and it creates decent work opportunities for people one kind. So the Green New Deal and that term, the just transition, have gone from being just legislation put forth on first world shores, and now come to spell the need to take everybody along on the pathways that we'll have to take to have a chance in hell to keep warming under 2 feet. It's now a labor deep in climate conversation in this very, very critical decade, where everyone agrees that decarbonizing rapidly is essential, but a just transition underlines that it must be fair, it must be inclusive, and it must be equitable. Now, what does it mean for the Global South? Now, it has increasingly started being used in especially developing world discourse around this energy transition. More so given that expectations are from rich countries that the developing world must cut its appetite for coal, gas, and oil at a rate that's unseen in history, while former colonial powers can drag their feet, and especially those who had all of the fossil fuel advantage, resources, and technology to demonstrate that countries need to reduce emissions. So at the same time, I mean, developing countries such as India have pointed out the acute lack of finance and tech transfer from the developed world to help economies in this transition. So at the same time, there is this recognition that workers still have their present as well as their futures tied to fossil economies. Now, millions of Indians still rely on coal for their livelihoods, and billions of them are the hardest hit. And a lot of these coal areas will come to be amongst the most affected by climate change. But these are also areas where coal has dominated every other economy. Now, I spent my 20s staring into some of India's biggest coal mines or staring into the abyss and deep into the void of these coal mines that swallow huge amounts of land to yield the energy vital to India's development. But it's a form of economy that does not guarantee the same power to Adivasi and indigenous communities that live around these mines. And in nearly every single coal block that I visited or that I researched, communities were shut out of consultations. They were shut out of these decisions around how is this energy derived, where does it go, and who gets access to power, and how is that reflected in India's energy decision making. Now, at the same time, we have 1.2 million people directly employed in the coal sector workforce, along with a much larger informal ecosystem. But at the same time, these numbers obscure who is within this ecosystem and who is left out.
I think we'll have to scroll because it's not going.
So, yeah, to continue, who is included within this ecosystem and who is left out is a really big question. Now, Coal India, which is the biggest miner in the world, the biggest coal producer, has a sort of rehabilitation and a land policy, where for every acre of land, a family receives a single job, right? So, which means you have small and marginal farmers who have then a hectare of land or a few cents. And that is something where they have been left out of formal employment. Now, at a point in time where the Indian coal sector meant you get out, you go into the pits, you take your shovels, and it was a much more manual form of labor. The promise of jobs is what got a lot of people to yield their land and give it over to large companies and sign this off. But Indian law and legislation shows that that has significantly also changed in terms of how they get to know that their land is being acquired. So very often it's just a couple of notices in a gazette which you can't access, which you cannot read, and which are rarely made available to you. But at the same time, how India mines has changed rapidly. Like we have moved from what was very manual labor intensive to very mechanized forms of mining. And that also leaves women also out of the picture, because India started having bans on women being able to work in underground mines. So right now, according to research by CPR, that women only comprise 8% of this workforce. So it also brings into acute focus who is left out of its current energy system, as well as its, if we're talking about a just transition, what would that mean for indigenous communities? What would that mean for women? And what would that mean for people with really small land holdings? But at the same time, there's been a lot of focus as well on how much and how many jobs will we be losing. But there is a significant amount of people lost their lands who are involved in protests as well as strikes in shutting down coal production, who never received the jobs that they were promised in the first place. So you have, in the middle of heat waves, you have people leading protest movements to shut down some of the biggest mines for these questions as to, okay, there are no productive jobs in these places, and they've already sacrificed their lands. And the jobs that are available are often like an activist would be like, okay, the kinds of jobs that they would receive would be washing teacups or doing menial labor. And it has also been accompanied with a complete shift to how India mines itself. So that has shifted largely to private mining companies playing a much bigger role. For instance, the Adani Group, Triveni Cenex, all of them have started being contracted as miners. So you will have a state-owned company subcontracting or having a mine allocated to it, and you have a private miner with none of the liability, none of the rehabilitation policies which a coal India might, being in charge of mining operations, and at the same time being able to benefit from subsidies as well as cuts that are made to the sector. Now, I know that I tweeted about a PowerPoint, but then my computer has crashed a few times. So I'm just trying to move these slides around, which I should be able to do from here.
Yeah, I think it needs to, yes.
To give you a picture, this was an image which I took at that time while I worked as a researcher at Amnesty International, and had the privilege of it being stolen or used by the coal ministry in one of its own Twitter ads to show that how India had reduced its imports and had increased domestic mining, whereas this indicates a village that no longer exists. And was blasted for the purpose of that mine. These are some of the consolidations which did take place, and this is people right before a public hearing around their lands being lost for this particular mining spending, and who had seen, these were people who seen these notices for the first time, and learned that their lands had been acquired in perpetuity. And they would not be able to object to this being taken away from them. So these are questions around who has a choice in India's development and what choices do people have, as well as their access to information. So the history of how development decisions, as well as this is perpetuated. So around 24 million Adivasis, which was roughly the current population of Australia, have been displaced by development projects since India became a republic. So we're also talking about projects such as large hydropower, as well as coal mines, road projects, and others. This is a woman named Nirupabai. It pains me to kind of bring up her image over and over again, but this is her house, which was demolished for one of India's bigger mines. The first time that I met her, she had a home. The next time, her home had been bulldozed along with the grain and was given no notice before this. And she has been struggling to be able to receive a job from India's biggest coal producer, from Coal India. And the fact is that, this is a legal case that she continues to fight. We recently heard that she managed to be able to secure some sort of employment. But the fact is that, whether it's activists or whether it's others who have been working on ground for, and unions trying to ensure that women receive more rights and have access to these jobs that we want to transition from in the very first place, that continues to be an uphill struggle. And at the same time, you also have the fact that, access to justice is difficult, but at the same time, you have this issue around, like at COP26, India's environment minister had spoken about phasing down coal, and what form that phase down actually takes place, or in what form that will happen raises a big question around, and we brought up lots of issues around who is employed, how many people will lose jobs, the idea that, of course, that livelihoods are fundamentally tied to coal, but there continue to be many who have fallen through the cracks and who are not formally part of this system. So we continue to expand coal without actually displacing coal from our energy system, but we talk about engaging or increasing installed capacity of renewables. Now, India's renewable and solar story has been one that the international papers love. And it definitely does look good on paper. It's a fairly ambitious target, and it's one that we have already achieved if we are talking about non-fossil fuels. But in reality, this is also a conversation, especially around installed capacity. And what does installed capacity mean? It means that you have an agreement. It means that it exists on paper, but it doesn't actually mean that you generate from these resources. It does not mean that you are thinking of the electricity system as a whole. It does not signify, how are you actually going to be building these things, and whether you will actually be thinking about things like transmission or distribution. So it remains on paper, and at the same time, you can increase it. So India wants to both increase coal, it wants to increase RE, it wants to increase hydropower, and at the same time embark on ambitious green hydrogen and other strategies. So how do we look at how this is going to go forward? But at the same time, we're also talking about a just transition. So India's one of the reasons why COP26 became especially memorable was Modi's Panchamrit, and this speech that India would be achieving net zero by 2070, which shows that there's a need to prepare for a phase down of coal, but at the same time, like this lack of a generation target leaves that very, very much up in the air. But if we were also trying to look at how and whether we do have, we're putting 106 new coal mines on the auction block, and there is no intention of stopping. So let's not even look into what is the transparency of current coal auctions and how India plans to proceed towards it. But the question that it raises is, what does the energy transition in all of its progressive tech futurism, what does it mean? Because has it fully embraced justice, fairness, and equity in how we mine for the minerals, not just of the past, but of the future? And are we going to continue with an extractive paradigm of the past? So now lithium, cobalt, manganese, graphite, zinc, rare earths are the new metals of the block, which are needed in large quantities to power the renewable electric future that India wants to wake up to. And while lithium, cobalt, and graphite are essential to make batteries, rare earths are essential to the sort of magnets that are used in EVs. But India has a scarce amount of these resources. And the global energy transition is also one which is going to be upending the world's energy map. The countries which were rich in fossil fuels may not be the countries that are rich in these particular minerals. And it already has meant a global mining boom as countries are shoring up supplies and plans to protect domestic industry. But what shape is this boom going to take, especially in countries in the global south that have either poor or plentiful resources, questionable environmental governance, a history of resource extraction by northern countries, and are the most impacted by climate change? So in February, the Indian government announced a substantial lithium discovery, except it was in Jammu and Kashmir. So the announcement was cheered by many. India imports nearly all of its lithium currently, right down to feed its EV industry. And a deposit of this size is huge. It exceeds deposits elsewhere identified by other countries, and the fact that this could propel us ahead of the energy race. But after all of the initial jubilation and celebration, that comes concerns that India is putting its cart before its self-driving Teslas, because for one, we have not yet assess just how much of this deposit is mineable, what quality it's going to be. The Geological Survey of India is yet to establish that. And there's also the longer shadow of what it means for people living in one of the most militarized regions on the planet and whose voices are often shut down for the greater good. And people, of course, have then tweeted that we've seemed to have conveniently forgotten that the last assembly elections in Jammu and Kashmir were in 2014, said experts. And where are the just energy transition people now? So yeah, the question is an important one, and one for India to consider as we embark on our journey to net zero. Of course, and seeing this and how it takes place across the world, so there are protests across Bolivia, across Chile, across Argentina on what mining for lithium means. In that case, it's mostly mining for water, which is lithium is in a form of brine, and from its there have been protests against water extraction, and also fears that will this mean a repetition? Is this going to be a similar or neocolonialism to yield the minerals that will fuel its future? So interestingly, Chile has nationalized its lithium industry following Mexico, and has, of course, has investors up in it at this point. But it is true that the world mines far more coal today than it does transition metals. But these other metals and minerals, EV and storage, will account for half of the mineral demand growth from clean energy technologies over the next 2 decades. To even get to the Paris goals would mean 4 times the mineral demand for clean energy by 2040. So yes, you're seeing demand for lithium, for cobalt, and nickel and copper growing. But at the same time, it also means extraction of elements such as aluminium and copper, which, as it was perhaps that was my entry point into environmental journalism or into activism and this entire sphere, which was again the fights in India's bauxite belt by indigenous communities, against large companies such as Vedanta that had looked at India's bauxite resources, and are we going to be seeing a similar boom? Those are practices that have not changed. We have seen deregulation, and we have also at the same time seen attacks on indigenous defenders. So it brings about this question of how is it, are we going to be continuing a similar model and in a vastly deregulated legal environment, pursuing this plan for our transition at this point. So is there a different way to do this? Researchers say yes. Of course, we've got the researchers who are looking at how the EV industry can reduce its lithium needs, or, for instance, like again, really ramping up public transportation, the fact that we shouldn't necessarily be focusing on a similar extraction model, decreasing the size of EV batteries and maximizing lithium recycling. But again, spending and prioritizing public transit could also ensure an equitable transition that protects ecosystems, respects indigenous rights, and meets the demands of global justice, is what they say. India could choose a similar path instead of the highway building, fossil fuel subsidizing spree that prioritizes cars and sacrifices pedestrians and communities and public health. But will we choose to transition to a more equitable form of resource use that it champions on a global stage? Or will we be repeating the same violent extraction that already are being witnessed in India's coal, bauxite, and mineral belts? Seems likely, but there seems to be hope from communities. But I mean, at the same time, you have talks of a phase down, but an increasing clampdown on activists as well as on lawyers as well as think tanks who have raised issues around coal. So if we're serious about a phase down, why are we silencing activists? Why are we silencing voices that bring out these issues and that have litigated against coal? And when they seem to be helping in our pursuit of what is a just and equitable transition.